last session regarding
German grammar and English. You have to.
questions of education, memory, on the United States, with the issue of liberated Africans we have seen before, questions in the Caribbean, Brazil, their life stories in Africa. For these sessions, we're going to have a few words at the beginning from the Vice-Chancellor of Students Affairs, Dr. Parham, which should I leave you with him. Thank you.
Let me say good afternoon to folks. Well, let me try that again. Good afternoon. I heard there was some very powerful work going on in here the last day and a half, yes?
Yeah.
First of all, let me say on behalf of our Chancellor, Michael Drake, we are proud in the fact that we have the only African-American chancellor in the history of the University of California system in a little old place like Irvine. So when people talk about we don't have an orange curtain in a place like Irvine, that answer happens to be yes. So we are very proud of him. And also our new provost, Howard Gilman. Both of them would always like to bring greetings on behalf of the campus and all of the faculty and staff and colleagues that are here. And I want to add my voice to the chorus of those that will simply say, thank you for being here in the last day and a half. Thank you for the intellect. Thank you for the really intellectual horsepower that helps to drive some of the discussions that we do. And in this particular piece where we talk about education, I thought I would add just a couple remarks to that. So I want to say thank you for inviting me at least to say thank you for being here and welcome to the campus. But I'm always interested in conferences like these because it brings together an impressive array of scholars and intellects who are prepared to not just regurgitate what everybody else does, but what I call push the boundaries. And pushing the boundaries on the discourse, particularly as it is related to issues of slavery and memory, and not simply historic memory, but in some cases even subversive memory, which is what I think lots of our ancestors had to have in order to survive the crazy that they went through. In whatever part of the diaspora they're in, I think this is a wonderful place to be able to do that. But I'm reminded as we think about the importance of conferences like this, that there are a couple of things I think we also want to pay attention to, particularly as we frame this within the context of education and why is it important for our students never to forget, particularly in 2013. I listened today to a video and a song on the internet that students here were trying to promote, not the song, but trying to advertise a particular event they have coming up on campus sometime in the future. And they're looking at artists. So here is a modern day rap artist, pretty popular. One of the probably top 3 or 4 when they did a student survey. So student surveys go out to black, white, blue, brown, purple folk on this campus. This person came up in the top 3. But it didn't take you probably not 5 sentences into this rap song to hear N words and B words and that kind of just vulgarity that was fascinating. That they justify by the fact that, well, he's black. And what's important to remember about historical memory, and I say this as a psychologist by training and a scholar myself, there's a difference between skin color and consciousness. So the fact that you happen to represent a particular hue doesn't necessarily mean you come to the table with the proper consciousness to be able to represent our folk. Somewhere I read that there ought to be something wrong with a body of knowledge that leaves people of African descent strangers to themselves, aliens to their culture, oblivious to their condition, and inhumane to their oppressors. And they don't even know what they do. Ought to be something wrong with that. So why is your work important? It is because in that particular light, there are questions I think that have to be asked. There are issues that have to be interrogated, but ultimately there are strategies that have to be developed to address what I think is a condition that in our space is out of control. If I were given $1 billion grant and I could take people anywhere in the world, I would go back and visit the slave dungeons I've been to in Ghana. Could pick any of them for that matter. But I've been to the dungeons at Elmina and Cape Coast. And I've been inside those spaces. I have a picture on my wall in my office at University of the Door of No Return. Just because we as the black psychologists did ritual in that space to be able to tell the ancestors in their spirit that somebody lied to say your children would not come home. We home. And we want you to know that we're doing okay and we're going to try to carry on their legacy. But once you've been inside those slave dungeons, and you can just smell the stench that is still in them and the spirit of the ancestors that is still within those walls, you know, right, that there was some serious pain and trauma and tragedy and devastation that went on in those places. The worst inhumanity man has ever seen. And we got whole generations of people who don't have a clue that it went on. And if you believe that ideas are the substance of behavior, then part of the behavior that our young people in particular, and even adults, engage in these days, whether they're in university environments or even outside these four walls of this institution, is a challenge because their ideas are wrapped around conceptual templates that I think are misguided. And part of what we have to do, part of what this important work is about, particularly in educational institutions, is to help them to be able to see a different worldview, a different way of being, to know from whence they come from. The great Algerian psychiatrist Frantz Fanon reminds us that the three important questions everybody ought to be able to ask and answer. And this conference helps them to answer one of them. The questions include, who am I? Who am I? The second question is, am I who I say I am? The third question is, am I all I ought to be? Who am I? Is a question of what is my nature, my essence, my character. And am I who I say I am is a question of congruence, meaning what is the level of overlap, congruence between what I preach and how I live. And for lots of people, not just non-Africans, I'm talking about people of African descent, the level of incongruence is quite pronounced. Why? Because we have forgotten in those spaces. One of the pieces I'm also reminded about, which is, I think, one of the more important books written, and if it were up to me, particularly as a psychologist, every black home in America would have one of these on the shelf next to some kind of spiritual religious text. It'd be a book by Carnegie. It was simply called The Miseducation of the Negro, 1933 is my name. And Carnegie Woodson argues that if you allow a people to control the way you think, you don't have to assign them to an inferior status. If necessary, they will seek it for themselves. You don't have to worry about going through the back door. If one does not exist, they will cut one for themselves and step through that opening, contributing to their own dehumanization. How prophetic he was. How prophetic he was. Why is the work you do in this conference important? Because even as this place we call America provides us with the illusion of emancipation. You did not hear me. The illusion of emancipation. And depending on where you were in the country at that time, either 1863 or 5, and got the word that somehow black folk were set free. What lots of us didn't understand is that the first thing they do when they enslaved you is put a shackle on your hands, on your ankles, and usually around your neck. But the very next thing they go after is a shackle on your mind. So that even when we give you that illusion of emancipation, we can take these off and allow you to run free, as long as we still got this on lockdown. And it is that level of conceptual incarceration that has our people contributing to their own dehumanization in this world. Why is what you do so important, particularly in educational institutions? Because we have to help people step into the light. We have to help people come and embrace who they are at the core of their being. We have to help people recapture that historic memory. Because if you don't understand and learn from your past, you certainly are doomed to repeat it within the future. I'll close with a comment I'm fairly fond of by one of, I think, the more interesting and progressive, even with some challenges, African leaders of our time, who was one of the first African heads of state, I believe, to be presented as a head of state before the UN, Kwame Nkrumah. And Akuma was important because he reminded others that we had to go forward ever, but backward never. Forward ever, backward never. So if you look at the Nkrumah monument and the mausoleum that is there, you'll see him, in fact, with his arms stretched out in a big old bronze statue that is really tall, reminding folks that we got to go forward. But there was always, an anchor point to his being able to step forward, which was never forgetting the past that they had come from. The Honorable Marcus Garvey reminds us, my friends, that chance never satisfies the hope of suffering people. And it is only through hard work, persistence, and self-reliance by which the oppressed ever realize the light of their own freedom. But what's also very true, if the oppressed don't have access to information, if they don't have access to historical knowledge, if they don't have a clue about where they come from, and as the brothers and sisters on the corner used to say in the neighborhood, if you don't know where you come from, any road will take you where you go. That's what underscores the importance of your work. And I thank you for being here and dedicating your time, your service, and your resources, and just your intellectual horsepower to this endeavor. Thank you very much.
So good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Bridget Trucks. I'm a tenured professor here at UC Irvine. I have 5 titles, but the 2 major ones are Professor of African American Studies and Professor of Art History. So I'm happy that Alex invited me to participate, and I'm happy to moderate the last panel of the session. I do want to remind you, if you get to turn off your cell phones before we begin. We have 2 speakers for this session, and I'm going to introduce each one before they come on. So I'll start with the first one, and then I'll introduce Professor Millward. This is a topic that Dr. Parham has already explained to us, I think inspirationally, the significance of education and memory in the United States, particularly in the context of the theme of this conference. And as someone who teaches African American Studies here to a large group of students in a stadium class with the help of wonderful graduate students, I am deeply entrenched in, as many of you are, in this whole process of getting the students to understand and be educated in historical memory, and to try to get the students to understand that there's a difference between what happened 2 years ago and 100 years ago. I have a really hard time getting the students to understand historical distance and proximity. So I invited all of them to participate in today's and yesterday's sessions here, and hope that they'll get some sense of the depth of the past and the nearness of the past at the same time. So our first presenter will be speaking on representations of enslaved Africans in current secondary U.S. and Brazilian history textbooks. His name is Nafees Khan. He is in the Division of Educational Studies at Emory. He earned a BA in Sociology and a minor in History from Tufts University in 2001, and obtained his PhD from Emory University in May, in 2013. From 2001 to 2003, Nafees served as a coordinator of youth programs at LaGuardia Community College in New York City, which operated 3 programs for teenagers, a comprehensive GED program, an after-school program for currently enrolled high school students, and a summer employment program. So he's been working on the front lines as well as in the academy. His current research interests include social studies and history curricula, as well as citizenship education in the United States and Brazil. And we also need to know that Nafees enjoys traveling, and he really enjoys food.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the words. I think it lends to the importance and significance of both academic scholarly work, as well as the work to review the work in education. And by education, in this case, I'll be speaking mostly of K-12 education in terms of history textbooks. So, my title of the presentation, of my talk, is The Representation of Enslaved Africans in Current Secondary U.S. and Brazilian History Textbook. This is actually this is my dissertation, my doctoral research. Also, how I came to, my voice just moved this.
Very sensitive.
I've said I had a powerful voice. But this topic of slavery in general has been quite fascinating to me in how I came to this topic, specifically this research, but also basically how I came to this conference. Since 2007, I've had the pleasure of working with David Eltis on both the Voyages website as well as the African Origins Project in the development of the site, as well as of the sites, as well as helping to develop lesson plans and organize teachers to develop lesson plans that made use of the Voyages database for a K-12 audience, as well as presenting the works of the website and the work of all the programmers and historians that spent countless hours putting it together to varying groups, everything from teachers and master's programs to senior citizens taking African American history classes to workshops to academics alike. And if you enjoy the melodious sound of my voice, just listen to the tutorial videos on either and you can continue at your pleasure. But without further ado, and I thank you for this, and Alex, a special thank you for inviting me to this conference. This is a real pleasure to come out here. So, the purpose of my study was simply to, well not simply, but to examine how slavery was presented in secondary U.S. history, U.S. and Brazilian history textbooks. Specifically looking at the complexities of legacies of slavery, how they're addressed in these textbooks. I conducted a content analysis of 8 current secondary history textbooks, 4 from the U.S. and 4 from Brazil. European merchants began bringing enslaved Africans to Brazil in the late 16th century and to mainland North America in the first half of the 17th century. By the end of the transatlantic slave trade in the mid-19th century, the perpetrators of the trade would carry over 12.5 million enslaved Africans to the Americas, 5.5 million which went to Brazil, nearly 45% of the total volume of the slave trade, and approximately 400,000 enslaved Africans, or about 3%, to North America. However, despite this substantial difference in the number of enslaved Africans brought to Brazil and to the United States, the domestic population of enslaved people in each country at its peak in the 1850s did not follow this pattern. The U.S. slave population was over 1.5 times the size of Brazil, 4 million to approximately 2.5 million, respectively. In 1810, for example, the 1810 U.S. Census, the slave population was about 1 million. So it grew over 3+ million people in the span of 40 years. The phrase positive growth rate to reflect the U.S. condition is a phrase that both explains and is quite problematic when you first hear it. It kind of hides much of what went on there. In particular, the sexual exploitation of women and the breeding practices, but also the nature of the conditions on board cotton plantation, which had lower mortality rates, for example, than sugar plantations. But nonetheless, although the brutality and inhuman nature of slavery were constants in both the U.S. and Brazilian contexts, the scale length, the United States abolished the slave trade in 1808 and slavery in 1865, whereas Brazil ended the trade in 1850 and slavery in 1888, and economy, among other aspects, varied enough to make a comparison of each nation, how each nation remembers slavery meaningful. Statement of the problem. Both the United States and Brazil have long and complicated histories of slavery, which have led to varying legacies and understandings about slavery in the respective societies. This important topic remains controversial, and future generations need to be given as accurate information as possible about the history, complexities, and legacies of slavery in order to be well-informed citizens. Recent developments from 2008-2009 serve to give symbolic indicators of the importance of still revisiting this topic of slavery over and over again. For example, in 2008 and 2009, the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate actually officially apologized to African Americans for slavery and Jim Crow. This was led by then House Representative Stephen Cohen from Memphis, District 8, I think it was, or 9, in Memphis. And in the actual text of the resolution, which was passed, there is an intriguing point that the House included, but I'll just read briefly just this part. It acknowledges that slavery is incompatible with the basic principle recognized in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. Acknowledges the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery and Jim Crow. Apologizes to African Americans on behalf of the U.S. people for the wrongs committed against them and their ancestors. And this is where the House added in a point that the Senate did not follow. Commits to rectifying the lingering consequences of slavery and Jim Crow and to stopping future human rights violations. How that commitment is acted out, we will see, but one of the ways I envisioned was actually through education and through programs. Reparations is another discussion that is well worth a discussion, but I think one way that is very immediate is what's going on in schools of future generation, of the future students of universities, the future professors, et cetera, et cetera. The Brazilian law in 2003 and again in 2008 sought to promote teaching about how the political, social, economic, and cultural contributions of Afro-Brazilians and indigenous peoples shaped the formation of Brazilian society. And lastly, as just a point in terms of a recent, another reason why it's important now, at Emory University earlier this year, President Jim Wagner of Emory, in a statement, referred to the 3/5 compromise as a compromise that we can learn a lot from. And the way it came out and his subsequent letter, he was addressing the, I believe it was the law school at the time, and then he wrote a letter of apology. What it showed was the problematic nature of just making a statement about the 3/5 compromise, to me, was, how can I say it? When I read this compromise, not the compromise, but when I read his wording, he was trying to make the point about debate and about the importance of forming a union and holding the country together. That slavery was such a critical divisive factor at that time, that without this 3/5 compromise, the Union as we know it would not have survived. Just kind of ignoring what the implications in his statement and in his apology didn't kind of said, I'm sorry you felt that way, was the phrasing of the apology. So nonetheless, I think it's important that these legacies of slavery, how it plays out at multiple levels, is still very salient and critical for us to continually process this work. It's not just, it happened, then let's move on to something else. So, this just as a brief, review of other scholars who've looked at textbooks specifically and who've looked at comparisons within the field of history and social studies education. There are no studies on the comparison of how slavery was presented in textbooks in the US and Brazil. And there's limited focus. I was only able to come across one study of Brazil, in English, published in English, on Brazilian history textbooks. And there's actually more of a take on the Brazilian publishing industry, the textbook industry, more than content analysis, if you will. Yes. As a term, just to summarize a few points from the research on slavery in textbooks in the U.S. context, the majority of the textbooks lack methodological detail and a lack of referencing of previous scholars on slavery in textbooks, even if they were in the same journal. So one of the journals, Journal of Negro Education, which was for years published out of Howard University, I believe, had about 4 different studies dating back from 1949 all the way up to the 2000s, and almost none of them referenced prior studies. So in other words, you're not building on previous scholarship. You're not critiquing and assessing and making that reference. And I think that was one of the things that was not there. But just as a brief thing about my methods, this was a textual and visual analysis. I developed a key term list in English and Portuguese in order to identify the references, the passages in the textbook where slavery was talked about. And I have to give a special thanks to Daniel Dominguez, who was one of my key informants in helping to develop the Portuguese and refining my coding system. And so in helping to identify either terms that were specific to the Brazilian context as well as those that are translatable across. I also broke down the analysis by what I termed, based off of these U.S. standards that were in history, called the spheres of history, the idea of cultural, economic, legal, personal, political, science and technology, and social spheres of history as a way to kind of differentiate the nature of these references to slavery that I would come across in the textbooks. Okay. As I mentioned, my sample, right. Although the specific sales data for the United States textbooks are not publicly available, I confirmed that the U.S. history textbooks in this study were included on several major states' lists of adopted textbooks, including those of California, Texas, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina. And for those who aren't aware of how the U.S. Textbook system works, just briefly, about half the states in the United States create a list of approved textbooks at the state level, and then either districts or counties can adopt from that approved list. The other states generally do it at a county or district level that they select which, or sometimes a school level, which textbooks they approved. And the biggest purchasers of these textbooks are Texas, California, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and New York State as well. They're the biggest destination, so the economics of the industry is an important factor. In Brazil, the Ministry of Education at the federal level publishes a list of 18 recommended history textbooks from which schools are able to select the desired books. However, unlike in the United States, the Brazilian Ministry of Education releases the sales number for each textbook purchased from the various instructional materials publishers. For this study, I've selected the 3 best-selling history textbooks based on quantity sold in 2010 when I initiated the study. These are the 4 American history textbooks. Maybe some might remember some of them, maybe some people may know the authors of some of these. If you do and they're your friends, I will just respectfully, the Americans, United States History, America, Pathways to the Present, and the American Pageant is an AP textbook. The Brazilian textbooks, the História Global, História Geral do Brasil, Historia and Historia Geral y do Brasil in the bottom right-hand corner. As I said, they were based off of sales, as well as a recommendation from a current Brazilian scholar of colonial history, as well as a former teacher in Brazil, who's now with Mary, Fabricio, another. Emory, there's a lot of Emory connections in this case. For those interested in reliability and validity, I was able to address for intercoda reliability and validity to address those for my study as well. If you're interested, I can go into more detail at a later date. So, one of the earliest findings I found, just specifically to the U.S., that I caught immediately, literally, as I'm looking through the book, was the table of contents of the 3 standard U.S. history textbooks. If you read the titles of these table of contents of these chapters, they're almost identical in order and in general sense of the title, with an exception to the chapters 7 and 8 of the Pathways to the Present. Is slightly different from the other 2. However, it's generally kind of reversed. So the first thing I noticed were the textbooks, almost regardless of publisher, they were already structured very similarly. And the sequence is actually is an important point in terms of how things fit into or brought into what is U.S. history. It's added into, not constructed and built around. So, this focus on a U.S.-centric history reinforces the narrative of U.S. history as what I termed a singular linear phenomenon that over time improves or progresses toward an ideal society as laid out in the founding documents, the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The presentation of slavery in these textbooks implied that despite the harsh or brutal realities of slavery, conditions of people have improved and that society will continue to inevitably progress. That is kind of the idea that it's an amorphous phenomenon, if you will, and it's moving towards a progress. That's the sense that you get from looking at the U.S. history textbook. One of the interesting points of comparisons, well, I'll jump into that later. Within the textbooks, the uses of the word slave versus enslaved. There was one textbook in particular that seemingly made a conscious effort to use the term enslaved person, enslaved African, enslaved African American, to a much greater degree than any of the other textbooks. The Americans, for example, which is one of the most widely used textbooks in the U.S., use the term slave 204 times, whereas enslaved person was only 26. However, United States history, which is a relatively newer, but also fairly widely published, had 157 slave to 111 enslaved. So it was almost a conscious effort to make use of that term when referring to individuals. For comparison, the American pageant authors used slave 328 times throughout the entire textbook and used enslaved only 19 times, mirroring the findings from the Americans. The distinction between the 2 terms was important when discussing slavery because the phrase enslaved person conveyed the belief that an individual's identity was not solely defined as a slave, but rather as a person who has been forced into the condition of slavery. There was a further unspoken influence, that someone enslaved them. Balance in the usage between the 2 terms can help to present a more humanistic, if you will, of those that lived in bondage, humanistic history of those that lived in bondage. In recent decades, scholars have been more sensitive to